In the autumn of 1883, in the red clay foothills of the New Mexico Territory, a man named Harlan Crew stood at the edge of what had once been the Sable Creek Ranch and gave an order to his hired foreman that he believed settled the matter for good. Burn it. The ranch house was already half collapsed, one wall sunk into the earth like a tired shoulder. The barn had lost its roof to a hailstorm 3 seasons back. The stone and timber outbuildings along the creek had been standing empty since the Vasquez family quit the land 7 years prior, and the weeds had come up thick through the yard between them. To Harlan Crew's eye, there was nothing left worth saving. He had acquired the note on the property through the First Meridian Bank of Santa Rosa in a transaction that took less than an afternoon. He had no use for the land itself, only for the water rights that ran with the deed. The creek was the thing. Everything standing between him and the creek he wanted reduced to ash and pulled timber. So the survey team he had hired from Albuquerque could walk a clear line to the water by spring. What Crew did not account for when he gave that order was that his foreman had a habit of drinking in Cimarron on Friday nights and was not a man who moved quickly on any instruction that wasn't accompanied by a deadline. He also did not account for the auction. The county land office had been notified of the property's encumbered status after Crew's purchase, and a clerical procedure had been set in motion that no one, including Crew, had thought to interrupt. The auction was scheduled for the first Saturday of October, and the notice was posted in the window of the Mora County Register's office for the required 21 days. Most people who walked past that window kept walking. The print was small, and the parcel in question was described with the kind of language that made even patient readers lose interest. A ruined homestead of approximately 240 acres, improvements in distressed condition, water access seasonal and unconfirmed, minimum opening bid $1. $1 is what it went for. The woman who raised her hand was named Celeste Varga. She was 26 years old, slight and straight-backed, with dark auburn hair wound up under a plain felt hat that was too large for her and had belonged to her father. She had come to Mora County 11 weeks earlier with $43 in a tobacco tin, a set of masonry tools wrapped in canvas that she had carried from San Antonio, and the particular knowledge of mortared stonework that her father had pressed into her hands over 16 years of working alongside him on every project he undertook, from the Rio Grande to the Pecos. Her father was dead. He had died in the July heat of that same year, his heart giving out between one course of stone and the next on a church foundation in El Paso. She had not been there. She had been finishing a chimney repair 40 miles west, and by the time word reached her, the service was 3 days past. She kept the hat and she kept the tools, and she settled his outstanding debts with what she had in the tin. And then she took the work she could find and moved north, because north was where the building was. Mora County had building. There were 2 new commercial establishments going up in the county seat, and she had spent 6 weeks setting foundations and pointing stonework for a contractor named Perez, who paid reliably and asked no questions about whether she had a brother or a husband who would be along shortly. She lived in a rented room above the feed store and ate simply and saved what she could. By the time she walked past the land office window and stopped to read the notice, she had $31 and no illusions about her prospects through the winter. The contractor, Perez, had finished his work and moved his operation to Las Vegas, and she had not found another steady commission. 240 acres with a creek and stone outbuildings for $1. She read the notice 3 times standing in the October cold. The stone was what caught her, not the house, which was mentioned only as a structure in distressed condition and was clearly finished, not the barn. The notice said stone and timber outbuildings in the plural, and that meant foundation work. That meant walls, and walls built from the red clay limestone of these foothills, by someone who knew what they were doing, would last 100 years without attention and would need only pointing and remortar to be sound again. Her father had taught her to read stonework the way some men read contracts. The composition of the mortar, the coursing pattern, the way the corners were dressed. A wall told you everything about the hands that built it and the likelihood that the bones beneath the surface still held. If the bones held, the outbuildings could be made into something. She did not know, standing at that window, what she would make of them or what she would do afterward. She knew what she could do with stone. If you have ever stood in front of something the whole world had written off and felt certain you could see what they had missed, then you know what Celeste Varga felt walking into that land office with her dollar. The auction drew 4 people besides herself. 2 men who had come, she gathered, to bid on a water easement claim in the same parcel, and who had not expected anyone else to be there. The county registrar, a lean and expressionless man named Dege, and a boy of perhaps 12 who appeared to have come only to be out of the cold. When Degas read the minimum bid aloud and asked for opening offers, Celeste raised her hand without hesitating. The 2 water easement men looked at each other. One of them shook his head slightly. Neither of them raised a hand. Degas looked around the room once, waited the required interval, and banged his gavel. $1. The man with the shaking head said, as she signed the transfer document, that she had bought herself a very expensive pile of rubble. She told him she had not bought the rubble. She had bought the stone. He did not appear to understand the distinction, which was, she thought, entirely his problem. The ride out to Sable Creek took 2 hours on a rented mule from the livery at the edge of town. She had packed a bedroll, 2 days of provisions, her tools, and a small oil lantern. The road turned to track, and the track turned to something that was mostly memory of a track, and the red hills closed around her on 3 sides as she came down into the creek bottom where the Vasquez family had built their home in 1861. She understood the moment she saw the property that the notice had not done it justice. The house was worse than distressed. It was a ruin in the most complete sense. The rear wall down, the roof caved onto what had once been the main room. One front corner still standing like a single tooth in an empty jaw. She had known not to expect the house. She looked past it. The outbuildings were 3. A long, low structure along the north bank of the creek that had been used, from the look of the iron fittings still set in the walls, as a curing shed or smokehouse. A second, squarer building nearer the old barn foundation that appeared to be in better repair. Its roof partially collapsed, but its walls clean and upright. And a third, smaller structure set slightly apart from the others up the slope toward the tree line, its door hanging loose on a single iron hinge, its south face weathered to the color of old bone. She started with the long building by the creek. She went at the walls with her probe first, a short iron rod her father had made for her when she was 16, and which she had used on every foundation inspection since, pressing it into the mortar joints at intervals, testing the give and the resistance, reading what the material told her. The mortar was a lime and clay mix, the kind common in this region in the 1860s, and in most joints it had dried hard and was still bonded tight to the stone. There were sections along the base course where ground moisture had worked in over the years that had gone soft and friable, and she found 3 places in the north wall where the freeze and thaw of successive winters had opened gaps large enough to admit her finger. Those she mapped with chalk marks and moved on. The walls were sound. The bones held. She worked through the afternoon in the cold October light, going systematically through all 3 structures, probing and marking and recording in the small notebook she kept in her coat pocket. The square building near the barn showed the best stonework of the 3, corners cut and dressed with a precision that told her the mason who built it had served a real apprenticeship somewhere, had been taught to measure angles with a bevel and to dress a joint before it was laid, not after. The courses ran clean and level from foundation to plate. The walls were 18 inches thick. Even with the roof gone, those walls were not going anywhere. The third building, the small one up the slope, was the last she came to. The light was going by then, and she lit the oil lantern and carried it through the hanging door. She stopped. The interior was intact, not merely structurally, intact in the way of a room sealed against time, a room that had been closed and not reopened. There was a work table along the west wall made of heavy timber, its surface worn smooth in 2 places where hands had rested for years. There was a set of shelves built into the north wall, still holding their load, tin canisters, a row of glass jars sealed with wax, a folded length of oilcloth. There was a small iron stove in the corner with its flue pipe still seated. Dust lay on every surface in a layer so even and undisturbed, it seemed less like neglect than like a deliberate act of preservation. On the work table, weighted by a smooth stone, was a sheaf of papers. She stood in the lantern light for a long moment. Outside, the creek made a small, persistent sound over its stones. The cold came through the door frame at her back. She crossed to the table. The papers were land documents. She could see that much from the first sheet. The formal printed language of survey records, the dense columns of metes and bounds, the signature lines and notarial seals. She could not read the full content in the lantern light, and she did not rush. She set the lantern on the table beside the papers and put her hands in her pockets and stood and looked at the room around her. Her father had told her on a job outside Tucson when she was 19 that a room sealed and kept tells you what someone believed was worth keeping. He had said it while they were pulling the foundation of an old Mexican land grant house, working around the objects the prior occupants had left in the walls, tools and coins and a folded letter they could not read. He had said that you always look at what a person locked away. She picked up the sheaf and held the top document close to the lantern. The papers she found in that room on the first night were not simple records. It took her 3 days to understand what she held, partly because the documents were dense with the overlapping instruments of New Mexico land law, partly because some pages were in Spanish and her Spanish was reading functional at best, and partly because the story the documents told was one she had to assemble from pieces rather than read straight through. She worked at the work table in the small building, moving the lantern and later the daylight from the one small window over the pages in order as she sorted them. There were 17 documents in all. She counted them twice and set them in 2 stacks, those she could read with confidence and those she could not. The Spanish language pages she set aside and worked around, returning to them in the evenings with her notebook and the dictionary she had borrowed from the lending library in Mora, working her way through the formal 19th century legal phrasing, one clause at a time. The cold made the paper stiff in her hands. She kept a fire in the small iron stove and worked in her coat and her father's hat. The documents had not been hidden so much as kept. There was a difference, and she thought about it while she worked. Something hidden is concealed in anticipation of a threat. Something kept is preserved against the possibility of a use. The Vasquez family had understood that these papers were worth preserving. They had placed them in the driest room on the property, the room farthest from the creek, with the stove for winter and the oilcloth as a further layer against moisture, and they had weighted them with a stone from the creek bed. Then circumstances had required them to leave, and the room had been sealed, and the papers had waited 22 years. She had done the arithmetic by the second morning. The Vasquez family had homesteaded Sable Creek in 1861, under a provisional federal claim ratified by the territorial government. The original grant was for 240 acres inclusive of the creek water rights, documented in a survey conducted by a government agent named Reardon in the same year. That survey had been recorded with the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe. In 1872, a second survey had been conducted under the authority of the First Meridian Bank of Santa Rosa in connection with a mortgage extension the Vasquez family had taken against the property. The 1872 survey had been prepared by a land agent who worked, as a secondary notation in the corner of the document revealed, under contract to a real estate and water speculation firm based in Albuquerque called the Conejo Group. The 1872 survey described the property boundaries differently than the 1861 survey. Not dramatically differently. The discrepancy ran to approximately 18 acres on the east side of the property, where the creek bent south, and to the water rights themselves, which the 1872 survey described as seasonal and unconfirmed. She looked from the 1861 survey to the 1872 survey and back again 3 times. Then she looked at the mortgage document the 1872 survey had been prepared to accompany. The bank had extended a loan against the property at terms that incorporated the 1872 survey as the authoritative record of the land's extent and water rights. The 1861 survey, the original federal grant, appeared nowhere in the mortgage documentation. It had been, for the purposes of that transaction, set aside. She sat very still for a while with the documents spread on the work table. The Vasquez family had mortgaged their land against a bank's survey that shrank the property and voided the water rights. When they had struggled to meet the payments, as anyone holding a shrunken and water-starved ranch in a dry year must struggle, the bank had foreclosed. The foreclosure had eventually been purchased by Harlan Crew, whose interest was the water he had been told he was legally acquiring, the water that, under the original federal grant, had belonged to the Vasquez family, clear and without condition. The 1861 survey was the true document. The 1872 survey was an instrument of dispossession. She set the stone back on top of the papers. She did not sleep well that night, and not because the bedroll was thin, though it was. She kept returning in her thinking to a thing her father used to say about the difference between knowing a thing and being able to prove it. He had been a practical man who believed in the primacy of physical evidence, perhaps because he worked with his hands in a material that did not lie. Stone laid badly would tell you. Stone laid well would tell you that too. The telling was in the work. She lay on the bedroll in the small building with the stove burning low and the papers on the table above her head, and she thought about the 1872 survey. The land agent who had prepared it had made the discrepancy small enough that a busy man might overlook it, or a family in debt and frightened might not see clearly until too late. 18 acres on the east side where the creek bent. The water rights reclassified from permanent to seasonal. Each change small in isolation. Together they made the difference between a ranch that could sustain a family through a dry year and a ranch that could not. She did not know whether the land agent had understood that. She suspected he had. That was the particular quality of the wrong she held in her hands. It had been done at a desk with clean hands and proper forms, and the family it undid had lost the language of the forms before they understood what had happened. She had the document. She needed to understand what the document was worth. In the morning, she rode back to town. There was a woman in Mora who kept a lending library in the back of her dry goods store, and who had, more practically, a husband who practiced civil law in the county and whose office she shared. Celeste had met them both briefly during her weeks of working for Paris. The lawyer's name was Holt, and she had no reason to think he would see her without an appointment, or without a fee she could not easily spare. But she had the papers under her arm, and she walked into the dry goods store and asked for him anyway. She waited an hour on a cane chair by the shelves of dress fabric, and then he appeared in the doorway between the store and the office, a compact and unhurried man of perhaps 50, with reading spectacles pushed up on his forehead. She laid the 1861 survey and the 1872 survey on his desk side by side and let him read. He read slowly and without expression. He turned pages. He went back once to the notarial seal on the 1872 document and held it close to the light from the window. Then he took off his spectacles and set them on the desk and folded his hands. The 1861 survey, he told her, was a federal instrument. It had been recorded with the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe, and its legal standing predated and superseded any subsequent private survey unless that supersession had been formally adjudicated in a territorial court. There was no record of any such adjudication. The 1872 survey had been used in a private commercial transaction, but had never been entered into the territorial record as the authoritative description of the property. He looked at her over his folded hands. What she held, he said, was a corrective record, not a claim, not a lawsuit. A corrective record introduced to the appropriate office in Santa Fe would restore the original boundary description and the water rights to the land. The land was hers, having been purchased at lawful auction. The corrective record would confirm what the land included. He paused. He said he would want to examine the documents at length before he could say more with certainty. He named a fee for that examination. It was more than she had in the tobacco tin. She told him she had $30 and would owe him the rest from work, and she named what she did for work. And he considered this for a moment and said that his office chimney had been drawing badly for 2 seasons, and his wife had been after him about it since Easter. She could begin there. She began that afternoon. The chimney took 2 days. It was a straightforward diagnosis. The flue liner had cracked along a horizontal joint 3 feet above the smoke shelf, and each winter the freeze and thaw had worked the crack wider until the draw was unreliable, and cold air backed down into the office when the wind shifted. She rebuilt the liner from the crack upward, setting new fireclay tile in a bed of refractory mortar she mixed at the ash door, and she tuck-pointed the exterior stonework on the south face where water had been getting behind the cap and working down. Holt watched her work from the doorway of the office for a while and asked no questions, which she appreciated. His wife, whose name was Clara, and who ran the lending library with a competence that extended to knowing the contents of every shelf without looking, brought her coffee at mid-morning and asked nothing either. After that, there was a retaining wall behind the land office that the county had been deferring since the spring floods. She rebuilt 32 feet of the wall, pulling the failed sections and relaying from the footing up, and she found in 2 places that the original builder had not carried the footing below the frost line, which was why the floods of the prior spring had moved it. She corrected both spots, cutting down through the clay soil to solid depth before she reset the foundation course. The county registrar, the same lean man Daga who had run the auction, came out on the 3rd day and watched her set the cornerstone for the repaired section and said nothing, but came back each of the following days and watched some more. After that, there was the foundation of a new schoolhouse being built on the north end of town that the general contractor was glad to have a mason he could trust. She worked through October and into November, steady and without complaint, and she paid Holt in installments every Friday, and he spent his Saturdays with the documents. She rode out to Sable Creek on Sundays. The pointing work on the long building by the creek she did herself, mixing mortar in a bucket she had found intact in the curing shed, and working from the base course up, filling the failed joints with careful attention and no hurry. The courses ran cleanly, and she found fewer soft patches than she had feared. The north wall's damage was more extensive, but not structural. She replaced 18 inches of the base course there with stone she collected from the collapsed section of the old barn foundation, fitting the new stone to match the coursing of the old. By the second Sunday, the north wall was sound. The square building she tackled through November, starting with the partial roof collapse and working backward to the walls that had been wet damaged by the years of unprotected exposure. The roof she rebuilt in stages, salvaging timber from the barn ruin, setting new rafters where the old had rotted past use. She was not a carpenter, but her father had been a workman who believed a mason had to understand every trade she touched, and she had helped raise enough roof frames to know the geometry. She did not burn the Sable Creek documents. They stayed on the work table in the small building up the slope, under their smooth stone, untouched while Holt worked and she worked, and the weeks passed. Harlan Crew made no move to clear the property through October or November. His foreman, she learned from a passing conversation at the feed store, had gotten into a dispute in Cimarron that had kept him occupied well past the season for any burning. Crew himself had business in Albuquerque that kept him south through the fall. The ranch sat. She worked. The nights grew cold enough that she could see her breath inside the curing shed while she mixed mortar. There is something particular about work done in cold weather, her father had told her once. He had said, "The cold keeps you honest. You cannot do careless work in the cold, because the cold will find every careless place you left and punish it." She thought of that often in those November weeks, working in the silence of the creek bottom with only the sound of her trowel and the water over its stones. In the third week of November, Holt sent word to the feed store that he was ready to file. The filing was done in Santa Fe, which required Holt to ride to the capital and present the documents to the Territorial Land Office in person. He was gone 4 days. When he came back, he told her the clerk at the land office had received the corrective record without drama, compared the 1861 and 1872 surveys, and confirmed that the federal document took precedence. The entry in the Territorial Register had been corrected. The property now described in the official record was the full 240 acres under the original boundary lines, with the creek water rights confirmed as permanent and unencumbered. He laid the receipt from the land office on his desk and pushed it across to her. She picked it up and looked at it for a while. Then she asked him what this meant for the note Harlan Crew held through the First Meridian Bank. Holt said it meant that the note had been issued against a property whose legal description was now confirmed as superseded. Crew had purchased the right to a diminished property with conditional water rights. The property that actually existed in law was different from the property in his documents. He would need to renegotiate or return, given that his interest had been the water rights specifically, and that those rights were now confirmed as belonging to the fee simple owner. He had considerably less than he believed he had purchased. She asked what Crew would do. Holt said a man like Crew, in his experience, would calculate the cost of contesting a Territorial Land Office correction against the cost of moving on, and would move on. She nodded. She was thinking about the square building and whether the roof pitch she had set was steep enough to shed snow. It was, Holt told her some weeks later, more or less what Crew had done. There had been a communication from his attorney to the bank, and from the bank to the land office, the kind of formal objection that precedes a quiet capitulation. The correction stood. Crew had other properties. He did not pursue the matter further. It was resolved in the way of a great many frontier land disputes, not through a judge or a confrontation, but through the weight of a document that simply said the truth. She spent the winter at Sable Creek. The small building up the slope, the one with the sealed interior, became her primary shelter. She had cleared it and cleaned it, and installed a proper length of stovepipe from the iron stove to a fresh hole she cut through the south-facing wall, and it was warm enough for sleeping when the stove was banked at night. The building was perhaps 14 feet by 16, a single room with the timber work table and the shelves and a low ceiling that held the heat well once the stove was running. She pulled the iron hinge off the hanging door and reset it, pinning the new leaves with a bolt she shaped from a nail and a piece of flat stock she found in the old curing shed. The door hung true after that and kept the wind out. She ate from what she could buy in town on her weekly rides in and from the salt-dried provisions she laid in through December, and she was not comfortable by any ordinary definition of the word. But she was not cold, and she was not hungry, and she had a roof over her head that she had pointed and repaired herself. The nights in the high red foothills ran cold in December, cold enough that the creek ran thin under a skin of ice by morning. She rose before light most days and had the stove going and the water pot heating before the sky had begun to pale in the east, and she worked by lantern until the light was good enough to see mortar color. The silence of the property in winter was a particular kind of silence, different from the silence of an unoccupied room or an empty street. It was the silence of a place that had held people and their habits and was waiting again. She felt it in the evenings especially, when the work was done and the stove was banked, and the only sound was the creak below and the occasional shift of timber as the cold settled into the frame of the small building. She found other things in the sealed room as the winter went on, and she went through it more carefully. A land plat, hand-drawn and unsigned, that appeared to mark the location of a spring on the east slope above the creek, uphill from any of the existing structures. She investigated and found it, a seep of water from a limestone shelf, small but constant, even in the dry cold of January. It came out of the rock face at a gap in the shelf no wider than her hand, the water clear and carrying a faint mineral smell of iron and clay. She built a stone basin around it to collect the flow, setting the stone in a half circle that would hold through frost, because she bedded it below the freeze line, working in the January cold with her hands in old gloves that left her fingertips exposed so she could feel the mortar set. The basin held its first full pool within a day. The water that had been seeping away into the hillside grass had somewhere to collect. Her father had said that the difference between a spring and a muddy seep was a mason. She thought he would have been satisfied with the basin. There was a photograph among the papers in the back of one drawer of the work table, small and mounted on cardstock in the way of the 1860s. It showed a family in front of the square building, which in the photograph had its roof intact and its walls freshly whitewashed. A man and a woman and 3 children, the oldest perhaps 10. They were not smiling, as people in photographs of that era rarely smiled, but they were standing together with a quality of stillness that was not unhappiness. The man's hand rested on the shoulder of the eldest child. The woman's chin was lifted slightly toward the camera. They were all looking directly at the photographer, which in that era required holding still for several seconds, and they had held still without visible discomfort, as though they were accustomed to occupying their ground without apology. She put the photograph on the shelf where the tin canisters stood, propping it against the wall so it faced the room. There was a family in Mora, she had learned over her weeks of work in the town, by the name of Vasquez, a woman of perhaps 60, originally from the ranch on Sable Creek, who had come to town when the ranch was lost and had been there since. She had children and grandchildren in the county and was known to everyone who had known the county for more than a decade. Celeste rode to town in February with the photograph and the 1861 survey and Holt's receipt from the land office. The woman's name was Elena Vasquez, and she lived with her daughter's family on the west side of town in a house with a bright blue door. Celeste had asked Holt to arrange the introduction, and he had sent a message ahead. So when she arrived, Elena Vasquez was at the table with her hands folded and her expression careful. The expression of a woman who had learned not to receive anything without examining it first. Celeste laid the photograph on the table. She laid the receipt from the land office beside it, and the 1861 survey with its notarial seal and its confirmed territorial correction, and she explained, plainly and without performance, what she had found and what Holt had done and what the correction meant. Elena Vasquez looked at the photograph for a long time without touching it. Then she reached out and set 2 fingers on its edge. She said the square building in the photograph had been her husband's workshop. He had built it himself, had cut the stone from the creek bed, and dressed every piece with a chisel he had made from an old file. She had not seen a photograph of it in 22 years. Celeste told her what she had done to the square building's walls and roof. Elena Vasquez looked up from the photograph. What Celeste said next was plain, and not preceded by any particular ceremony. The land was hers by purchase, and the correction confirmed it. She had no wish to hold it against the family that had built it and been removed from it by instruments that the territorial record now confirmed were defective. She was not in a position to give the deed back, not because she was unwilling, but because the dollar she had paid was a legal transaction and undoing it was not a simple matter. What she could offer, and what she proposed, was a lease at a rate determined by what the property could honestly produce, for as long as any Vasquez family member wished to remain. Elena Vasquez did not answer immediately. She was quiet for a while with her hands flat on the table, and then she said that her grandson knew the land. Her grandson was a young man of 20 named Thomas, quiet and capable, who had been born the year after the family left Sable Creek and who had grown up hearing about it. He came out to the ranch in March with his uncle and 2 cousins and walked the property for an afternoon. He did not say much. He stopped for a long time at the stone basin Celeste had built around the spring on the east slope, looking at the water collecting in the basin. And then he looked at the coursing of the stone and the way she had set the bearing stones below the frost line. He said his grandfather had built in this same style. She said she knew. She had read it in the walls. There is something that passes between people who understand the same material, who have learned from the same tradition of careful hands, that doesn't require much language. She recognized it, and she thought he did too. By April, the ranch had 2 people living on it, Celeste in the small building up the slope, and Thomas Vasquez in the repaired square building that his grandfather had built from the creek stone. He had arrived in late March with a single mule, a bedroll, and a wooden crate that held his tools and a small collection of books, and he had spent the first 3 days walking the property alone from one boundary to the other, coming back each evening with mud on his boots and a notebook in which he wrote in a small, close hand. He did not share the notebook. He was a quiet person who did not fill silence with speech, which suited her. He knew cattle, and she knew stone, and the arrangement was practical from the first week and required very little negotiation. She finished pointing the long curing shed in the spring, and it became, in Thomas's use, a proper storage building for the equipment he began to bring up from town. He handled the east pasture fence with help from his uncle, a taciturn man of 40 named Ramos, who came out 3 Saturdays running and worked all day without stopping, and ate his dinner in the yard, and was gone before dark. The fence along the creek boundary had been a particular concern, and they spent one Saturday afternoon walking it together, she and Thomas, noting the failed sections and the places where the posts had heaved in the frost. She would set the post bases in stone rather than earth, she told him, and the frost would not move them again. He looked at her work on the spring basin and said that would do it. Elena Vasquez came out twice in May and walked the property slowly and said very little. but stood for a long time in front of the square building with her hand on the wall. The second time she came, she went inside, and Celeste did not follow her. She waited in the yard. After a while, Elena came out and crossed to where Celeste stood and said, in a voice that was level and carried no particular inflection, that the fireplace draws clean. Celeste told her the flue had been intact. The building had kept well. Elena looked back at the building for a moment. Then she turned and walked to her horse and rode back toward town without ceremony, which was a form of trust that required nothing more said. The corrective record had been filed and confirmed. The water rights were clear. The creek ran through Sable Creek land under the authority of the original federal grant, and no banknote and no subsequent survey could alter what the territorial register now said. Harlan Crew had moved on to other water. That fall, she took a commission to rebuild the foundation of a church in the town of Wagon Mound, 40 miles north. She was gone 6 weeks. When she came back, Thomas had mended the fence along the east boundary and had driven 6 head of cattle onto the upper pasture and had begun clearing the creek bank brush that had been growing since the family left. The place had the look of land that was being used again. She climbed the slope to the small building and went inside and lit the stove and sat with her tools rolled in their canvas on the table beside her. The photograph of the Vasquez family was still on the shelf. The 1861 survey had gone to Santa Fe and was now part of the territorial record. What remained in the room were the tools and the tin canisters and the glass jars and the oilcloth and the smooth stone that had held the papers down, which she had kept without quite meaning to. She picked it up and turned it in her hand. It was sandstone from the creek bed, worn round by water, the color of old rust. Her father had said once that the great problem with buried things was not that they were hard to find. The great problem was that someone had to care enough to look. She had looked. The document had been there. The walls had been sound. The smoke rose straight from the stovepipe into the cold October air, and the creek made its small and constant sound below. And the hills held the color of late season, and the land was what it had always been, patient, waiting, prepared to give itself to the right kind of attention. She set the stone back on the table and went out to see what needed doing before the dark came on.